In 1761, a shipwreck happened in the Indian Ocean. 180 people were stranded on an empty island. Not a drop of water, no trees, no food, no animals, just sand everywhere. How did they survive? 2 months later, the French crew built a ship on that island with nothing. How did they manage that? But beyond that, when they escaped with that ship, they left 60 slaves behind. "We'll come back, we'll bring help," they said. Those slaves waited for 15 years, and what happened on that island will leave your jaw on the floor. On the night of July 31st, 1761, pitch darkness fell over the Indian Ocean. The French East India Company ship Untold was sailing forward. Captain Jean Lafargue had ignored the warnings on the maps and convinced himself there was no danger in these waters. Just after midnight, the ship suddenly shook violently. Untold had crashed into coral reefs not shown on the maps. With successive impacts, the hull cracked and massive waves smashed the vessel against the rocks. The crew found themselves in a life-or-death struggle. About 160 Madagascan slaves locked in the lower deck holds were screaming in terror. Some desperately pounded on the locked doors, fighting the rising water, but in the howling storm, these screams meant nothing. With morning's first light, survivors faced a horrifying scene. The ship was in pieces. Of the 140-member French crew, 122 survived. About 60 Madagascan slaves managed to throw themselves ashore. Dozens locked in the ship's holds had drowned. Total loss was about 130 lives. The place they found was extremely small and desolate. Tromelin Island, surrounded by coral reefs, was a barren pile of sand with nothing but a few scraggly bushes. No fresh water, no food. Captain Lafargue was in shock. He was illegally transporting 160 slaves without the government's knowledge. Being rescued meant explaining those slaves. When the captain withdrew, command fell to first mate Castellan de Forges-Boucher. Having lost his brother in the crash, Castellan took charge and began organizing the survivors. Initially, the white crew and black slaves worked together. They gathered everything useful from the wreckage. They dug a well in the sand and found a water source at 16 feet deep, though mixed with salt water. Supplies, tools, and planks from the ship were collected. They hunted sea turtles, birds, and gathered eggs. Their new profession was fishing. Castellan set up 2 separate camps. French crew and slaves settled in different areas. The natives built a stone oven. A primitive forge was set up with iron pieces from the wreckage. Work was done together, but food distribution had a class difference. The French gave the slaves less food. They began building a new boat with materials left from the ship. After 2 months, a small sloop was built using planks and sail canvas from Untold's wreckage. When launched, it was impossible for everyone to escape. On September 27, 1761, the 122 French crew under Castellan's command crowded onto the Providence. There was only room for the white men. The slaves who couldn't board were begging and pleading. Many desperately tried to convince the French to take them, but it was futile. The small boat was packed. The French had chosen to fit all 120 whites rather than take half of the 50-person slave group. Castellan looked at the 60 helpless slaves. "Stay calm. We'll return in a few weeks. We'll rescue you, we promise." The slaves cried out, "Please take us." But it was futile. The Providence set sail and disappeared over the horizon. The 60 Madagascan slaves left on the sand stood staring, hoping the captain's word would be kept. They were left hungry and thirsty in the middle of the ocean on an island with no resources. Before we continue with the video, please subscribe, turn on notifications, and like the video to support us. A promise can change a person's life. That promise would indeed change it. Before long, hope gave way to deep doubt. In the first days after the French left, the slaves kept watch day and night, hoping a ship would appear. They kept their eyes on the sea as if a sailing ship would return for them any moment. But days chased weeks, weeks chased months. When they faced the reality that the promised rescue wouldn't come, indescribable fear and helplessness filled them. Still, some among them wouldn't give up. If they could endure long enough, maybe one day they could be rescued. A few months later, 18 people desperately tried to escape from the island. They made a makeshift raft from wreckage planks and barrels. Maybe the wind would carry them to Madagascar. Those staying on shore tearfully bid farewell to their friends. No word was ever heard from the raft that disappeared over the horizon. Those waiting looked to the horizon every day, but there was no trace. The 18 brave souls had probably been lost in the ocean's savage waters. Another attempt had failed. Those who left didn't return. As time passed, the island's population eroded at a horrifying rate. In the first months, many lost their battle with disease, thirst, and hunger. Before even the first year ended, many were laid to rest in graves dug in the sand. Deaths continued over the following 5 years. Hunger, thirst, and disease claimed one more person each passing month. They scorched under the sun and shivered in storms. One more from the 60 was buried each month. By around 1766, only 15 people remained alive, most of them women. The women had to establish a small order for themselves. At a higher point the waves couldn't reach. They built huts by stacking coral and limestone blocks. The walls, about 5 feet thick, would be their shelter against tropical storms hitting the island. Since there wasn't even a single tree, making fire and keeping it alive was a great blessing. They kept the fire alive by carefully using wood from the wreckage and making primitive flint from metal. Over time, they became quite successful at fishing. Their new profession was fishing. There was nothing else to do but survive. The island was completely flat. They built a watchtower in the middle. Their eyes were constantly on the sea, hoping someone would come across this island. As weeks turned to months and months to years, a handful of people with no choice but to wait were slowly losing their sanity. Each new grave meant their hopes fading more. They were technically free now, but abandoned to their fate. They'd been stranded on this island for over 10 years. In 1773, a ship's silhouette appeared on the horizon. For the first time in 12 years, they saw a sail. The castaways got excited and lit fires to make the ship notice them. However, the ship didn't dare approach or didn't care much and continued on its way. The first ship, after 12 years, ended in disappointment. The next year, a French ship couldn't approach from the reefs, but a sailor swam to the island. The desperate women immediately took refuge with the sailor and began pleading. However, due to bad weather, this rescue was cut short. The ship even had to leave its crewmen behind and flee the storm. The stranded French sailor began living with the castaways, but could only last 2 years. In 1775, he took the last 3 remaining men and 3 women and built a raft using remaining materials and left the island. But the group that left didn't return either. Only a handful of women remained on Tromelin Island. Alone with memories of so many who had lived and died here for years, they began accepting their absolute end. A year later, on the morning of November 29, 1776, another sailing ship appeared on the horizon. Unlike the others, this one tried to approach from a different point before the women could even signal, and succeeded. For the first time in years, a ship had managed to approach the island. The ship was La Dauphine, under French naval officer Chevalier de Tromelin's command. Yes, the island would take its name from this heroic man. The freed slaves who had been waiting for rescue for exactly 15 years couldn't believe their eyes. La Dauphine found a sheltered route and approached, despite the rocks. Boats were lowered. The rescue team set foot on the sand. Tromelin and his crew were frozen at the scene they encountered. On the sand stood 7 women wrapped in strange garments woven from bird feathers and a tiny baby in someone's arms. The 8-month-old baby boy had been born and survived in this harsh place. A woman had given birth on this empty island with no help and kept her baby alive. It was living proof of human resilience. As the rescue team tried to understand how the Madagascan women had lived for 15 years, they were shaken with amazement. On this island, with no trees, they had made fire, built shelter, and survived. Bone piles scattered across the island showed they'd been fed for years by hunting birds, fish, and turtles. Tromelin immediately took action to bring these forgotten people back to civilization. The 15-year ordeal of tremendous suffering, hunger, and hundreds of losses had ended. The women and baby were able to leave the island, where those who left never returned, never to return themselves. The story of people who survived 15 years on an empty island became one of the most extraordinary examples of human resilience in history. What would you have done? Would you have waited not knowing how long you'd be on the island? Or would you have risked your life for freedom and built a raft to sail into the vast, endless ocean? Be sure to share your thoughts in the comments. We work very hard to research and bring you these incredible stories. You can support us by subscribing, turning on notifications, and liking the video.